On my birthday, my dad sat me down and hit me with something I never could have seen coming. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "We sold your car and emptied your college fund. Your sister deserves a clean slate." Then he slid a thick loan agreement across the table. I had two options: co-sign my sister's $22,000 debt or get out of the house. I didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't even raise my voice. I just packed my things in silence. By the next morning, they found the letter I'd left behind. Now, my sister's in a full-blown panic. Dad's driving around the city trying to track me down, and Mom is sitting in the living room crying. I'm 19, but I honestly thought turning 18 would mark the moment I stepped into adulthood. Instead, it turned into the day my family showed me exactly where I stood in the pecking order. That morning had started out like any other. Mom made her usual pancakes, and my younger sister was buzzing around the kitchen, talking nonstop about her upcoming freshman year at the expensive private college Dad had somehow pulled strings to get her into, even though her grades were average at best. I'd been excited to finally talk about my own college plans. I'd been accepted to the state university with a partial scholarship, and with my savings and the college fund, I thought I had everything lined up perfectly. After breakfast, Dad asked me to sit with him in the living room. The look on his face made my stomach tighten. Mom stood nearby, wringing her hands, while my sister pretended to be glued to her phone. That was the setup before the bomb dropped. He explained that my sister had been reckless with money all through her senior year. She'd maxed out credit cards buying designer clothes, paying for fancy dinners with her friends, and even covering a spring break trip to Marlow, the same one I'd assumed Dad had paid for. By the time anyone realized, her debt had ballooned to $22,000. Her part-time retail job couldn't even cover the minimum payments. Then came the second gut punch. Dad told me they'd sold my car, the Honda Civic I'd been driving since I got my license, the one I thought would take me to college. Not only that, but the entire college fund I'd been counting on was gone too. All of it had been funneled into covering her debt. I just sat there, numb. That fund had been built slowly by my grandparents, every birthday, every Christmas since I was born. It wasn't just money, it was their way of investing in my future. And my car wasn't just a vehicle, it was independence, my ticket to work, to school, to building something of my own. Both of those things were stripped away in one conversation. But Dad wasn't finished. He slid a stack of papers across the coffee table. A loan agreement. He said I needed to co-sign, making me legally tied to $22,000 of my sister's mistakes. If I refused, I'd need to find another place to live. That's when my sister finally looked up from her phone. She tried to justify it by saying college costs more than she thought, and after working so hard in high school, she deserved to enjoy her senior year. She just assumed the family would bail her out. Apparently, the family meant me. Mom chimed in, suggesting I could take a gap year, get a full-time job, and try for college later. She even painted it like it would be a character-building opportunity, as if cleaning up my sister's mess was somehow a lesson in maturity. The irony was so thick it almost made me laugh. I glanced at the payment schedule. The numbers alone told me that signing meant giving up years of my life, just to cover bills from handbags, parties, and Marlow. I thought about my acceptance letter, about how I'd busted my ass keeping a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week at a grocery store. And now all of it was slipping away. Dad pressed me for an answer, saying I was an adult now and needed to make adult decisions. That loan agreement sat there like a loaded gun, and I realized that no matter what I did, things would never be the same between us again. I told them I needed time to think. Dad gave me until morning. He made it clear if I didn't sign, I couldn't stay. Mom suggested I crash at my aunt's place, like that would soften the blow. That night in my room, I weighed my options. Either I sign, give up my college dreams, and spend years paying off debt that wasn't mine, or I refuse and basically accept being homeless. Neither path seemed fair, but only one allowed me to keep my dignity. I grabbed a notebook and started writing. I poured out 18 years of frustration onto paper, every moment where I'd been the afterthought. I wrote about birthdays where my sister got big, shiny gifts while I got something practical, about vacations cut short because of her tantrums, about all the times I'd been told to be the responsible one, to set the example, while her needs always came first. I wrote about what they'd truly stolen from me. The college fund wasn't just cash. It was nearly 2 decades of love and faith from my grandparents. My car wasn't just wheels, it was my independence, my chance to build a life on my own terms. In the letter, I told them exactly what their decision had taught me. I was the backup plan, the expendable one, the person they could sacrifice whenever my sister screwed up. They expected me to shoulder responsibility while she skated through life without consequences. I ended the letter with my decision. I wasn't co-signing anything, and I wasn't going to live in a house where my only value was as a safety net for someone else's mistakes. I thanked them, in a way, for making it so clear what kind of family I'd never want to create for myself. I packed what I could into 2 duffel bags and my school backpack. 18 years of my life boiled down to what I could carry. I placed the letter on my pillow with my house key and that loan agreement they'd shoved at me. Before dawn, I slipped out. I walked 6 miles through the dark to the bus station. The night before, I'd called a friend's older brother. He'd graduated last year, working construction now, living in a tiny apartment across town. He said I could crash on his couch until I figured out my next move. And just like that, I was gone. The bus ride gave me a chance to clear my head and think about what life looked like from here on out. I still had my job at the grocery store, and without being chained to anyone else's schedule, I could start picking up extra shifts. College wasn't off the table either. I could defer my enrollment for a semester, maybe even a year, while I built up savings and figured out how to stand on my own 2 feet. It wasn't the plan I'd mapped out, but for the first time, the timeline was mine to shape. Update 1. By 8 o'clock that same morning, my phone was already blowing up with calls and texts. Mom had found my letter, and the moment she finished reading it, she called Dad home from his morning jog. My sister overheard the whole meltdown when Mom started crying in the living room, asking Dad how they could have possibly let things spiral this far. Mom called first, and I could have predicted every word before she even said it. She wanted me to come home and talk this through as a family. She promised we could reach some kind of compromise. Maybe reduce the loan amount or stretch out the payments over a longer period. She just couldn't grasp that the problem wasn't the fine print. The problem was that they thought my future was theirs to carve up and trade away. Dad's calls had a different tone. He rang twice, leaving voicemails that started with pure anger and slowly shifted into what I guess he thought was reason. He told me family members are supposed to help one another, accused me of being selfish and short-sighted, and said that if I could walk away over money, it proved I never really understood what family means. My sister's texts were the most revealing. She started out swinging, calling me dramatic, selfish, and immature for bailing on the family over something that could be worked out. But as the day wore on, her messages changed. She started asking where I was, if I was safe, if I needed anything. The panic in her words told me she was finally realizing that her mess wasn't going to clean itself up without me. I didn't answer any of them. I'd poured everything I had into that letter, and I wasn't about to start negotiating from the assumption that I owed them my future. Update 2. 3 days after I left, reality started to hit them. Dad had banked on the idea that threatening me with homelessness would back me into a corner, that I wouldn't actually choose uncertainty over family duty. He'd already promised my sister that her debt would be handled, and now those promises were crumbling. Mom took it further. She called my job, fishing for details from my manager. She even drove to old friends' houses, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen me or knew where I was staying. That kind of desperation made it clear. They finally understood I hadn't just stormed off to blow off steam. I was really gone. Meanwhile, my sister's situation got uglier. Credit card companies started calling nonstop about missed payments. Dad had convinced her it'd all be sorted quickly, so she'd stopped making even the minimum payments. Interest kept piling on, late fees stacked up, and her credit score was tanking by the day. Dad's voicemails grew more frantic. Some were filled with rage, calling me childish. Others were desperate, begging me to at least let them know I was alive. He spent hours driving around town, checking spots he thought I might be, even asking neighbors if they'd seen me. Even my grocery store manager pulled me aside, saying my family had been calling and dropping by, asking about my schedule. I asked him not to share anything. I explained that I was working through a family situation and needed some space. He nodded and said not to worry. He'd always appreciated how reliable and hardworking I was anyway. Update 3. A week later, I got a call from my aunt, Mom's sister, who lived about half an hour away. She said Mom had called her in tears, asking if she'd heard from me. My aunt has always been the practical one in the family, the kind who asks the uncomfortable questions everyone else avoids. Mom had told her the story from their perspective, spinning it like I'd overreacted to a simple request for family support. But my aunt pushed back. asking for details about the money, the timeline, and what other options they'd even considered. The more she pressed, the less sense their version of events made. She asked if I wanted to grab coffee, not to convince me to go home, just to hear my side and see if she could help. We met at a small diner halfway between her place and the couch I was crashing on. I laid everything out. The loan papers Dad had shoved in front of me, the fact that my car and college fund were sold off without my consent, the ultimatum I'd been given. She sat there, listening quietly, shaking her head now and then and muttering things under her breath. When I finished, she finally spoke. She gave me context I hadn't known. Dad's business had been shaky for months. He'd been taking pay cuts, losing contracts, scraping by. Turns out, the pressure had been mounting long before my sister's credit card fiasco. That explained why cashing out my future felt like their only option. But unlike my parents, my aunt didn't just offer sympathy. She gave me solutions. She said she could help me open a bank account that was fully mine, co-sign for an apartment if I needed, even provide references for better jobs. Most of all, she told me I'd made the right choice walking away from being forced into debt that wasn't mine. She also gave me her perspective on my sister. She said this wasn't new. My sister's debt was just the latest chapter in a long pattern of behavior. My parents had been rescuing her from her own mistakes for years, always stepping in instead of letting her learn responsibility the hard way. Update 4. 2 weeks after I left, things at home were unraveling fast. My aunt became my main source of updates. She'd talk to Mom, then quietly pass information along to me. My sister's debt had snowballed. Without my signature on a consolidation loan, she was stuck juggling multiple high-interest cards. Minimum payments, late fees, and penalties kept stacking, and her balance had already jumped from $22,000 to almost $25,000. The monthly payments were climbing right along with it. On top of that, Dad's consulting business was in worse shape than I'd realized. He'd been using credit cards of his own to keep the lights on, hoping things would turn around before the bills came due. My sister's financial meltdown had forced him to look at the bigger picture, and what he saw was ugly. The family's finances weren't just strained, they were hanging by a thread. Mom's emotional state started unraveling once she finally grasped just how deep their problems went. She spent days on the phone with relatives, begging for help, asking if anyone would co-sign or loan money to cover my sister's debt. But one by one, everyone turned her down. Some were shocked, not just by the size of my sister's spending problem, but by the fact that my college fund had been wiped out to cover it. Meanwhile, my sister was beginning to taste reality for the first time. Her retail paycheck couldn't stretch far enough to cover both the ballooning credit card minimums and her living expenses. That meant goodbye to the lifestyle she'd once thought she deserved. She moved back into her childhood bedroom full-time and took the city bus to her job because Dad could no longer afford insurance for multiple cars. The bigger crisis hit her when it came to college. The private school she had bragged about required proof of financial stability before students could register for classes. With her credit wrecked and no cosigner willing to take on her debt, her admission was hanging by a thread. Dad made desperate calls to the school's financial aid office, trying to explain their situation, asking for exceptions or extensions. But private schools don't usually bend the rules for families who can't show financial stability, especially when the problems come from reckless spending rather than unavoidable hardship. My leaving created another problem they hadn't planned for. I quietly handled a lot of the small but necessary things around the house. Groceries, yard work, small repairs, keeping things organized. Without me there, those responsibilities shifted back onto them, adding to the stress they were already drowning in. Exactly 1 month after my birthday, it all came crashing down. My sister's enrollment was canceled. The school placed her on a waiting list for the next year, but only if she could sort out her credit issues. Dad's consulting business officially went bankrupt, forcing him to shut it down and, for the first time in 15 years, apply for traditional employment. Mom suffered what my aunt later described as a full breakdown. She had to be hospitalized briefly for stress and anxiety. Losing her son, watching her daughter's dream school fall apart, and seeing her husband's business collapse all at once. It was more than she could carry. When I heard about all of this, I felt complicated. I wasn't happy they were in pain, but I also wasn't shocked. Their choices had been unsustainable for years, and they had built their lives on the assumption that I would sacrifice my future whenever my sister stumbled. All I saw were the natural consequences finally landing where they belonged. Meanwhile, my own life was stabilizing. I'd moved into a tiny studio apartment and picked up more shifts at the grocery store. I started laying out plans to begin college the following semester. Not on the timeline I'd once pictured, but on my terms. This time, it was built on a foundation I could actually trust. My own work, my own decisions. My manager noticed the effort I'd been putting in and offered me a promotion to assistant supervisor. The extra income made it easier to save for school and gave me work experience I knew would pay off no matter what career path I took. I never answered their calls, never texted back, never responded to the messages they sent through other people. The letter I'd left behind said everything that needed to be said. And every event that followed only proved I had been right in my assessment. They hadn't seen me as a son with his own future, just as a solution to someone else's problems. 6 months later, I got an update through my aunt. My sister had enrolled in community college while working full-time to chip away at her debt. Dad found a corporate job as a project manager. It didn't pay what his consulting used to, but at least it was steady with benefits. Mom was going to counseling and had picked up part-time work as a substitute teacher. They were rebuilding, but for the first time it was without leaning on me as the safety net. My sister was finally forced to deal with her own mistakes, and according to my aunt, she was even showing small signs of learning financial responsibility. As for me, I started college that fall. I relied on loans in my own name, a partial scholarship, and the money I'd saved from work. It wasn't debt-free the way it could have been if my college fund had been left alone, but every step I took was mine. Every dollar I borrowed, every payment I made, those choices belonged to me, not to someone else's crisis. My story doesn't wrap up with some tearful reunion or a moment of forgiveness. Instead, it ends with a truth I had to learn the hard way. Sometimes the only way to protect your future and your self-respect is to walk away. My family showed me who they really were when they tried to corner me with financial manipulation and guilt. I believed them and I built my life accordingly.